Stellar Blade is a very strange video game. On one hand, the gameplay is solid, there's plenty of content to engage with, as well as replay incentives, and the degree of upkeep and support the game has received bodes well given the devs have already announced that a sequel is in the works. On the other hand, the game's a bit of a hot mess. Nearly every single element of the game's design feels quite disparate from one another, and the story is a confusing mess of vague and poorly translated writing, forgettable if not outright bad voice acting, and characters that feel as if they're operating on completely different rules and mechanics from one another. It's interesting, there's so much to criticize about the game, but it's also just strong enough on its own that I feel it does warrant proper follow-up. The foundation is all there, and I think if Stellar Blade 2 can build upon what works while also refining what doesn't work with the first game, we could be in for one seriously great line of games if they decide to make a full-blown series from it. When it comes to Stellar Blade, a lot has been said about how the game handles its use of sex appeal. Yeah, we're just gonna go ahead and rip this band-aid off. Expression of sexuality in art is a strangely divisive topic, and gaming is certainly no exception. However, I would like to provide my own perspective on the issue and how it pertains to Stellar Blade specifically. Even if you come from a different place on this subject, I hope you can at least understand what I feel does and doesn't work about it, at least in regards to Stellar Blade. Firstly, in my opinion, sexuality is just as fair an avenue for art to explore as any other subject matter, and part of what's fun about sexuality is that it can be explored in such a variety of ways that, while ranging in their perspective, can all maintain a certain degree of value depending on the intent. Most relevant to Stellar Blade, perhaps, would be works like Overwatch, Mass Effect, The Witcher, Bayonetta, and even other mediums like comic books are just a handful of works that just want to have attractive characters for the sake of having attractive characters. Even music can often highlight things we find sexy just because it wants to do so. Artists like Scene Queen, Chappell Roan, Sabrina Carpenter, Janelle Monáe, even classic rock bands like AC/DC and Guns N' Roses are all examples of musical artists with songs that are pretty much just them saying, "God, I love sex." All of that's completely fine. In fact, I think in many ways it's something of a modern answer to the way that older art was made to admire the human form, such as paintings and sculptures. Now, is it always that deep to the people making the work? Obviously not. But that's okay. Sex appeal doesn't always have to be a deeply explored, complex facet of a character's design. Much like when it comes to the real thing, you're allowed to have it just for the fun of it, as long as you're being considerate and conscious of avoiding hurting others. Heck, when it comes to video games and other media that just want to have fun, I would even argue it's just better that way by default. The Legend of Zelda is already one of the greatest video game series ever produced, and the fact that Link is now a femboy sex icon just adds to its enjoyability. Heck, I'll admit it, there have been times where I've bought games solely because, woo, dang, that character is fine as hell. Sometimes it works out, as was the case with games like Bayonetta. Every now and then, though, you get a game like Wet, and yeah, that one, not so good. All of this is to say that I have no issue with characters being hot just for the sake of being hot. Eve being a total baddie, it's not a sin, okay? However, where Stellar Blade goes wrong with its sex appeal is the simple fact that they do nothing with it. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't need the art I engage with to make excuses for or somehow justify why a character is so hot. That just seems like really dumb to me. Eve's appearance is one of the most bodaciously over the top that I honestly think you're gonna find in any professionally produced art, and yet she might as well look like Art the Clown because it would unironically make no difference in the actual world of Stellar Blade. Not a single character has anything to say about her appearance, and because she's a socially inept toaster, she has no way of owning her appearance for herself either. The complete lack of acknowledgement towards Eve's sexuality leaves her appearance feeling pretty meaningless. Not in a harmful way like some sex appeal can be, it's just so benign and almost irrelevant that she winds up sticking out like a sore thumb. For comparison, let's look at Bayonetta. Bayonetta is a similarly over-the-top character when it comes to her design. However, Bayonetta owns her sexuality. She knows how good she looks, and she owns it in how she expresses herself both in and out of combat. Her sex appeal isn't just a surface-level detail, it empowers who she is and what she does. Eve? She's just hot. That's it. Nobody in the world of Stellar Blade even cares, and Eve herself is completely oblivious to it as far as I can tell, meaning that she has nothing to play off of. And that's a shame, not because we need to arbitrarily justify characters being hot, but because there's actually a lot of potential to work with that just isn't being explored. It's frustrating to me as someone who loves the art of video games to see something that could actually be worked with used so lackadaisically, if not just being outright ignored. And hey, it doesn't have to be some deep thing about Eve. Sure, you could try and make a more progressive narrative that explores the intrinsic link between sexuality and identity, and it could absolutely work given Eve is a robot trying to find her humanity. That's a tale as old as time, and sexuality is absolutely capable of being explored through such an arc. But like I said, it doesn't have to be that deep either. It could be as simple as a running gag of characters stumbling over themselves trying to talk to Eve. This would allow for a lot of fun character moments while also allowing us a way of coming to understand other characters as we meet them. Characters that don't stumble over themselves when talking to Eve for the first time would stand out, while those who do would allow for a slew of enjoyable and silly moments that give the game an extra breath of life. Even a simple gag like this could realistically enrich the experience substantially. The encompassing issue with Eve is the simple fact that she really doesn't have anything going for her outside of her appearance. How does a South Korean supermodel android with a British accent that's capable of pulling off moves this cool turn out so bland and uninteresting? I'll give you exactly 5 seconds to guess. Time's up, I lied. It's her personality. Well, actually, it's her lack of personality. Eve is just a boring character. She does very little to move the plot forward herself. She feels very static in regards to her own development, and she speaks in a monotone voice from the moment you start the game to the moment the credits roll, and aside from collecting soda cans, there's very little that you could actually say about her besides, "Hey guys, did you know Eve Stellarblade is so freaking hot?" Anyways, yeah, I'm gonna let the mic cool off a bit from that one. It's a bummer too, because I actually think that with the right stuff, Eve could be an instant icon for reasons beyond, "Hey guys, did you..." In my opinion, there are two aspects of Eve's character that stand out: her personal innocence and her violent brutality. As a robot who knows nothing about the human experience, and as we've seen made abundantly clear, Eve has zero concept of sexuality. However, since she has been designed to kill Naytibas, she is a straight-up killing machine. These are two very juxtaposed character traits, and given that Eve's character arc seems to be about finding her humanity, I think it makes sense to use either of them as a foundational platform to further build upon her character. Given the fact that Eve is this ultra-brutal killing machine, I would really enjoy seeing a more angsty, edgier side of the character. Given the post-apocalyptic nature of the setting, I could absolutely see Eve embracing her humanity in a way that leads her down a darker path where she becomes a straight-up menace with a no-nonsense attitude. Not only would it be a compelling direction for the character, but she would also stand out as a female character with an edgy streak, which itself really isn't that common across video games, or at least action games. And it doesn't have to be all dark either. Like, imagine how funny it would be for this ultra self-serious version of Eve to enthusiastically be collecting soda cans around the maps. That's just comedy incarnate. It would be completely ridiculous, but I honestly think people would love it. Heck, go all out and turn her into a goth dommy mommy. Best-selling game of all time right there, you're welcome, Shift Up. You'd be harder pressed not to buy that game, come on. Going back to Eve's more innocent demeanor though, you could actually take her in the direction of characters like Zoe from K-pop Demon Hunters or Bubbles from the Powerpuff Girls. Instead of turning angsty, have her approach humanity with unbridled innocence, smiling gleefully as she brutally dismantles these biblical and Lovecraftian abominations. It would also perfectly complement her collecting of soda cans, making it this cute, quirky little detail about her fun-loving personality. And who doesn't want to follow a fun-loving character? The sheer tonal juxtaposition alone would make for endless entertainment, and much like the edgier Eve that I talked about a moment ago, there really isn't much else on the market like her in the sphere of character action games. I'm by no means against Eve being ridiculously hot, but it does bum me out that there really is no more to her than, "Hey guys, I've always felt that the more over-the-top something is, the more obligated creatives and artists are to play off of it. It just doesn't make sense to me to go so all out on something, only to let it sit there while you completely ignore it in every other facet of the art. Like, why? I don't need for Eve to be an especially complex female character so that we can arbitrarily justify her appearance. However, I do need for Eve to stop being such a boring, static character, and I think exploring her sexuality, even in lighthearted ways, is one of many ways that we can improve upon her character going forward. Moving on to gameplay, simply put, I think the combat is by far Stellarblade's greatest strength. It's a sort of cross between character action and Sekiro combat, and honestly, I'm here for it. It's a bit lacking in originality, but what's there works seriously well. Basic combos follow a similar blueprint to games like God of War, where different combinations of light and heavy attacks lead to different combos, combos. It's a blueprint we're all familiar with at this point. Square, 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 square for your basic combo. Square, triangle, triangle, triangle for another combo. You get the idea. This on its own isn't much to write home about, but Stellar Blade also grants the player a plethora of special abilities, all of which can be used at any point in your combos. Not only do these attacks just look incredible and feel great to pull off, but the fact that you can string them into your combos means the player has a great deal of mechanical freedom to get as creative and flashy as they like with their offense. Furthermore, these attacks will require the player to burn either burst or beta energy in order to use them, with each respective meter getting 4 abilities which draw from them. A lot of games like this tend only to limit abilities like this with something like a cooldown, but I much prefer the use of proper meter burning because the inherent resource management acts as an additional wrinkle of complexity for the player to consider in the moment-to-moment play, which further heightens the tensity of combat and thus the player's enjoyment. There's also a gun mechanic, and while most are understandably quick to write this off as a needless addition, I actually appreciate it as a part of Eve's kit, though that's not to say it's without its drawbacks. The problem with the drone gun isn't that it doesn't work or that it's ineffective, but rather that it just doesn't gel with the melee combat in a way that feels natural. Unlike Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, where guns simply act as an additional attack map to a single input, or Nier Automata, where your gun is a drone that behaves independently from your other attacks, Stellar Blade's drone gun is quite literally its own mode of combat that you essentially have to swap to on the fly. Your lock-on is immediately broken and the camera itself switches to an RE4 style over-the-shoulder perspective. This, in my opinion, was just a bad call as far as design goes. The animation itself is nowhere near as snappy as one would like in a combat-heavy action game like this, and the length of the animation can actually cause issues with the controls when you're trying to use it quickly enough to keep up with the more intense combat of the late game. Furthermore, switching between ammo types requires the player to pull up a whole new menu and use the stick to select the ammo type that they want to use. Also, and I want to emphasize that I'm asking this next question respective of the game design specifically, why does Eve's gun draw from a limited ammo pool? Like, really. I get that the game can't just let you fire heat-seeking rockets ad infinitum, but I feel like they could have just implemented a cooldown for each ammo type that would effectively yield the same results as reloading, but without, 1, requiring us to restock on ammo, which is basically infinitely available anyways, and 2, limiting the scope of player expression. This is why games like DMC and Bayonetta don't have ammo counts, because it just doesn't make sense for these more fantastically driven action experiences. Could you seriously imagine playing Devil May Cry 5 and Dante running out of ammo on his guns? Yeah, that sounds like the opposite of fun. The whole process of utilizing the drone gun just isn't very intuitive, which is a shame because otherwise the gun itself is legitimately very useful. The damage it deals is nothing to scoff at, especially after you start getting those upgrades, and I've had a ton of fun incorporating it into my playstyle. The pistol's great for explosive barrels, targeting weak points and shredding lower level mobs. The shotgun is fantastic for stunning enemies and shattering barriers. The rockets can even stagger bosses while dealing huge chunks of damage, and the laser beam, well, it's a freaking laser beam. Even if it was genuinely completely useless, which it's not, it still just looks so cool. But Stellar Blade isn't just about the offense. In fact, I'd argue that the defensive play is made just as important even on normal difficulty. Oh yeah, real quick, Stellar Blade is not an easy game. Like, I was legitimately caught off guard by how challenging it turned out to be. I first played through the game on normal mode, and I actually found myself dying repeatedly several times throughout the experience. This game doesn't mess around, and the enemies will punish your reckless play accordingly. But it's also not so oppressive that the average player won't have fun with it either. All it really asks is that you learn the mechanics and respect your enemies, which, hey, I'm down with that. As for the game's hard mode, I think I died more on Stellar Blade's hard mode in one playthrough than I did in my first run of Elden Ring, and please bear in mind, I was playing on New Game Plus, following a 100% playthrough where I was utterly stacked with gear and upgrades. The Raven boss fight alone killed me more times than Radahn ever did, and that is including Shadow of the Erdtree. I kid you not. This chick whooped she is just on a whole nother level. Of course, difficulty is highly subjective, and honestly, I'm sure there is going to be at least one comment where they're like,
I don't think that you actually found it as hard as Radahn. There's no way that it's as hard as that.
But hey, this fight, I mean, it demands that you be a beast at this game, and by the time I was done, yeah, I felt like a freaking freaking beast. I felt like I was just, I was the top of the food chain. You cannot touch me. Getting back to the defensive play though, this is definitely where the Sekiro comparisons become more relevant. Stellar Blade's defensive system is predicated on a very similar mechanic to the posture system of Sekiro, with perfect parries dealing stagger damage, which will eventually leave enemies vulnerable to a visceral, critical, you get the idea. The parry system overall is excellent, with enemy attacks being telegraphed just well enough to be able to read within reason, but not being so predictable that inexperienced players can just blitz the game with perfect parries. As well, the animations themselves are just downright fantastic, and there's little to no input lag that would cause issues with the rhythm. The game's hit feedback is honestly just perfect. In fact, it kind of reminds me of Metal Gear Rising. The dopamine rush just, God, it goes so hard sometimes. If I had one point of contention though, it's the fact that the critical strikes are pretty underwhelming. Not in the hit feedback itself or even how they're presented, in fact they look pretty badass, but the actual damage, it's okay. Not great, not terrible, I guess. Bear in mind, higher level enemies take a lot more perfect parries to render vulnerable, so it just doesn't feel that satisfying, pulling off so many technically impressive strings of inputs only for the reward to be such a low energy equivalent to a high five. Especially on hard mode, that Raven fight should have been all about the critical strikes. Dap me up like Arnie and Weathers, okay? Don't give me that weak little slap. Nah, give me the real one. There's also a dodge mechanic, and while it isn't quite as fleshed out or as fundamental as the parry, it's still a worthwhile mechanic to practice all the same. Certain enemy attacks are simply impossible to block or parry, meaning it's on the player to identify those moments and react accordingly. It's not especially hard to do so, but that's alright because the point is more so about retaining player cognizance than catching them off guard or punishing mistakes. There are also unique forward and back dodges that have their own mechanical incentives as well. The forward dodge sees Eve sweeping around the enemy to strike from behind, while the back dodge sees her doing a Witch Time style backflip animation that leaves the enemy vulnerable to a follow-up. These dodge techniques aren't usable at just any time though, instead being signposted by certain enemy attacks sprinkled throughout the game. Admittedly, this does make these techniques feel a bit limited as far as the creative and mechanical scope, but I still appreciate them as additional spice to the combat. And they're not so few and far between that it becomes an inconvenience or frustration either. None of these are irrelevant, they're just not as common as other mechanics throughout the game. The last mechanic I wanted to talk about was the Tachyon mode. It's a devil trigger. And there you go. I just told you everything you need to know. Okay, maybe that's a bit dismissive, but it's not exactly dishonest either. Late in the game, you unlock the ability to enter Tachyon mode, where Eve becomes crazy overpowered, shrugs off damage, and can dish out unlimited super moves exclusive to this mode for the duration that it's active. You have a limited meter to draw from, and you'll revert back to your base form once it runs out. I mean, hey, if nothing else, it does look incredible, and it certainly is useful, especially on hard mode, but like, there's really not that much I can tell you about this mode that I couldn't also say about God of War's Rage mode, DMC's Devil Trigger, Metal Gear Rising's, what was that, Jack the Ripper mode? I don't know. Or really any other action game super mode. It's nothing we haven't seen 1,000 times over, and honestly, that is kind of a bummer because it's starting to feel like this very mechanic is just something of a crutch for action games that they just put in for the sake of ticking a box rather than exploring a unique mechanic. I mean, come on guys, Devil May Cry's been implementing all kinds of fun twists on the mode for years now, so why can nobody else seem to do that? Give me something interesting to work with here. Don't just give me a super mode that's crazy OP. I mean, yeah, that's the fun of it, but give me something else, you know? Overall, I really enjoy Stellar Blade's combat, and honestly, there's very little that I feel needs to be actively improved. With a bit of reworking to the gun drone, a bit more creative innovation on the Tachyon mode, and perhaps retuning certain mechanics like the critical blows or even just the overall utility of dodging, I could easily see Stellar Blade becoming a series that stands proudly amongst its peers in this genre, and I mean that. The foundation here is rock solid, and I think that with perhaps the introduction of at least one new mechanic, one that feels like a true Stellar Blade original, we could really have something incredible on our hands. And that really is the truth. I think Stellar Blade has a rock-solid foundation that a sequel could massively improve upon. It's a tale as old as time, right? A new IP drops, and although there are obvious kinks to iron out, the game is still quite well regarded, and the sequel potential is as high as the developers want it to be. Just look at the original Borderlands and how much an improvement Borderlands 2 turned out to be, or the Batman Arkham games with City turning out as incredible as it was. I truly believe that Stellar Blade has the potential potential for that caliber of a sequel. But if we are to get a sequel at the level of Borderlands 2 or Arkham City, I think Stellar Blade needs to figure out what exactly it wants to be. Right now, more than anything, the biggest thing holding the game back is the sheer lack of focus with its various design elements. As it stands, the whole game feels like a mishmash of conflicting design elements that have zero synergy or reason to inhabit the shared space that they do. Let's take a brief look at the art direction, for instance. There's a slew of visual inspiration all over Stellar Blade, from Nier Automata to Final Fantasy to Art Deco, Greek art, cyberpunk, Judeo-Christian art, The Matrix, Bayonetta, Silent Hill, Christmas. The list just goes on and on and on. And hey, I'm not against a clash of artistic elements if there's something intentional being done with them. Games like Borderlands, Persona, Final Fantasy, The Legend of Zelda, and plenty more are highly renowned for their ability to blend so many seemingly conflicting artistic elements into a cocktail of fine art. Stellar Blade just doesn't do that though. You can try and infer some sort of connection between these visual designs all you want, but when the main three characters look like they've come out of completely different games and spend so much time together in environments that complement not even a single one of their designs, I think it's fair to say that a lot of this was put together without much care or tact. I hate to sound harsh towards the actual artists who helped to bring this game to life, I only mean to suggest that the lack of visual direction and focus is pretty apparent even at a glance. Then there's the tone. I honestly don't have a clue what sort of emotional response the game is looking to get out of players, and I think the biggest reason for this is the sheer dryness of the presentation. All of the dialogue is so flat, as if the voice actors were just given no real direction and just told to read off whatever was on the paper, even if it doesn't make that much sense. I sort of get it for Eve, at least at first, but everyone else speaks with the exact same dull cadence as her, minus the British accent, which I don't like. Why does Eve have a British accent? Like, why? There are times where the game seems to be taking itself rather seriously, but there's also times where it's rather shamelessly silly, like with collecting the soda cans. And hey, I'm all for tonal shifts when done right. I think games like Persona and Devil May Cry are downright exceptional at balancing the serious events with their more silly antics. But Stellar Blade just has nothing to glue this all together. Sometimes it's trying to be serious, sometimes it's just being goofy and self-aware. You just kinda have to roll with it, because there's no actual connection between the two, and I think it takes a lot away from the player's ability to immerse themselves in the game. It's hard to feel like anything really matters when everything is just happening without any connective tissue. Yeah, you know, sometimes we're laughing, and sometimes the storytelling actually gets pretty emotional, but it just feels so out of the blue, like an RKO for storytelling. Like, what am I supposed to really be feeling here? The reason I think these issues are more serious than, say, balancing hit damage is because ultimately I feel like Stellar Blade is in a place where it just lacks any semblance of an identity. Right now, the game's most known for stirring up a total controversy with morons who wanted people to be outraged at hot anime girls for some reason, and that's a shame. Stellar Blade is a good game, and if we really are getting a sequel and potentially a series, then I hope what we get manages to carve out a proper identity for itself. I want Stellar Blade to succeed as an IP, I want the combat to evolve, for the characters to grow into their own, for the design elements to begin coalescing into an experience unlike any other, and I hope that Shift Up recognizes this and begins to make it into something of a priority, because I honestly believe that that's the real key to whether or not this game will turn out to be more than just a fun little gem forgotten by most people a decade from now. I grew up in the good old days of gaming, okay? I've seen too many genuinely phenomenal and even massively influential titles just die off into obscurity for one reason or another. Time Splitters is probably the biggest example of this, but there's plenty more that I could list out. Overall, I think Stellar Blade is a great action game. Between the combat, customization, progression, there is more than enough here to justify giving it at least one full playthrough. So far, I've clocked in about 80 hours across 3 playthroughs and a full run of the boss rush mode, and I kept playing well after I'd already gotten the Platinum Trophy. When it comes down to it, I'd give Stellar Blade a rock solid 7 out of 10. It certainly has its problems, much of which are to be expected given it's an all-new IP from a relatively young studio, but what's there to appreciate and enjoy far outweigh these problems, and I think that's what matters most when it comes to fresh new IPs like this. The foundation is all there, but it's also not so strong on its own that I think they can just coast by without acknowledging the issues present. Anyways, that's gonna do it for today. This is my first review since coming back to YouTube, and I really enjoyed putting it together for you guys. If you're interested in seeing more, please feel free to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you thought of Stellar Blade and what you would like to see in a sequel. Also, please hit the share button and copy the link to my video. It only takes a moment, and even if you don't actually post the link, copying it is all I need to help get that bump in the algorithm. But if you could share it somewhere, well, that'd just be swell too. Until next time, everybody, take care and have yourself a happy little day.